Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. What I want to do today is to walk you through a little bit of what a public financing system looks like. And what I'm not going to tell you too much about is how we passed it. But I do want to say that this was something that Common Cause and a coalition of 50 organizations worked on for more than a decade. It was a long campaign to pass reform. And as we worked over a decade to pass a public financing law, over the time we'd push for a public financing law starting a decade before, and we'd lose. We'd get it through the House. We'd get it through a few committees. In 2000, actually, we passed a public financing law, and John Rowland, Republican governor of Connecticut, who was hugely popular, vetoed the law in 2000. And we saw real opportunity in 2004 when John Rowland was involved in a huge sweeping gift scandal. He had taken many gifts from lobbyists, state contractors, had given huge no-bid contracts worth $100 million, several $100 million no-bid contracts to build buildings that were never used. He took gifts for a cottage, a hot tub, a Ford Mustang, all kinds of gifts. And at the time that the scandal broke, the House and Senate were ready to impeach him, and he eventually resigned. But many people thought it was simply a gift scandal. What we did as a coalition was to do a number of campaign finance studies to show that the gift givers gave far more money, in fact, 10 times the amount of money that they gave in gifts in campaign contributions. And part of what we thought was very important to do is to show that the corruption trail really began on the campaign trail, and that this wasn't just a story of one bad apple, one corrupt person. This was more about a corrupt system and why we needed to change it. So I love this quote from In These Times, but really it makes it sound like it was really quite easy to do. Even with fighting for a decade to do this, and a very well-resourced campaign where we worked with labor and environmental groups, social justice groups, poverty groups, good government groups, and a core of Democratic lawmakers that really wanted to do this, and a campaign of probably about $1.5 million to do phone banking and canvassing and polls and studies and actions, direct actions, and print ads, TV ads, and radio ads. It was sort of a big campaign for Connecticut. We still almost didn't get it done. Part of the goal, and one of the reasons why it was a bipartisan reform, was that we worked with a Republican governor. The Lieutenant Governor, Jody Rell, stood next to John Rowland for 10 years. And we met with her early on in 2004 when she took office, and she said, I want to reform our campaign laws. I want to shut down loopholes. And she went through a whole list of things she wanted to do, and she said, but I hate public financing. And the coalition stood solid and said, we don't care if you hate public financing. It is not reform unless you enact public financing. We need to free candidates from special interest money. We need to have options to the corrupt system as it exists. We need to break the connection from the people who give donations and what they want in return once you're elected. So she said that she would keep an open mind, and we began organizing to do a lot of work to get public financing passed. So when we pass the public financing bill, I'm going to walk you through a little bit about what the benefits of the system are. I just don't want to make it seem like this is easy to do. And as we work, Common Cause and many of our allies across the country, we know these fights are really hard because you are essentially saying to incumbents, the system that elected you is corrupt and it has to change. And we need to open up this system to people who are not connected to special interests, to people who are not wealthy, and give them a fair chance at running and taking you down. So incumbents don't like this, and this is why, so far, we are the only state that has passed this legislatively. It is not an easy thing. But we have high hopes when you can find a strong coalition, take advantage of corruption, or a strong leader. In New York State, Governor Cuomo has said that he wants to play a leadership role in passing public financing in New York State. So it can happen. It's just not easy. But anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about what a system looks like, and also what are some of the benefits of a public financing system. First, a public financing system allows candidates to run for office raising small donations from individuals. So to qualify for a House seat, for instance, and I'll walk through a few charts with you a little bit later, to run for a House seat, you need to raise in qualifying contributions $5,000 in amounts of $5 up to $100. You can't take money from corporations, you can't take it from state contractors, you can't take it from lobbyists. So you're forced as a candidate, because many incumbents don't want to do this, to go out and talk to people in their district. There's an additional requirement in Connecticut's law that says you have to raise 150 of those donations from towns within your district. So they need to go out, and it's actually not that hard, but many people complain about how hard it is. And so what this means is candidates, instead of meeting in small rooms with lobbyists, or in the case of our Connecticut State Senate, many state senators would go to 1 or 2 lobbyist receptions, raise all the money that they needed to run for election, and it was that simple. Instead, now they're going out talking to real people who give contributions that help them qualify for a grant. So $5 matters as much as what they used to get in $20,000 political action committee contributions. So once they qualify by raising that money, then they get a grant, and then they can spend their time talking to voters about issues instead of going out and continuing to chase down the dollars. So they're running differently when they run for office. The other thing about this program is that it opens up the system for new candidates to emerge. So candidates that are not connected to wealthy special interests, candidates who are not personally wealthy, can run. If you're willing to work hard and reach out to people in your district, you can run and win under this kind of system. A poll, and this was just enacted in 2005, and we've only had 2 sessions. 2008, where the General Assembly, House and Senate ran under the system, and then in 2010, where we had both the legislature and all statewide candidates running under the system. So we're fairly new, only 2 election cycles under our belt. But when we polled candidates that ran in 2008, 78%, and these are new candidates that ran under the public financing system, 78% said the most important factor was the public financing and access to resources to run a credible campaign to get their voice out. When we set up the limits for this law also, it was important to not give small grants, but to give grants. What would it take to run a competitive campaign where a challenger could actually beat an incumbent? So when we set this system up, that was one of the things that we looked at. Since this has been in place, we have seen increases in primary challengers. And some of our allies in the progressive world, and Common Cause is nonpartisan, but some of our allies in the progressive world have used this as an opportunity to do primary challenges from Democratic incumbents and challenge them and take them on so that they can elect more progressive candidates that listen to the kinds of reforms that they want to see. So we've seen a dramatic increase in primary challenges, and actually a dramatic decrease in the number of unopposed elections. In addition, we've seen more competitive campaigns, so that the differences between an incumbent or but between a winner and a loser have decreased significantly. Back in 2006, before we had public financing of elections, usually you would see the average difference 33 percentage points. When this came into effect in 2008, that dropped by 10%. So instead of a 33% difference in the vote, it shrunk to 20%. And then in 2010, the campaign shrunk to become more competitive, and it shrunk a total of 15%, so another 5% for 2010. So we're starting to see, as candidates and challengers get more resources, they are better able to challenge incumbents. I think more importantly for those of us that work on a wide variety of issues in Connecticut, and I still get up to Connecticut to do some lobbying, elected officials govern differently. And for me, it was remarkable to see freshmen legislators who were elected under the public financing program in 2008 first come to the General Assembly and walk around the legislative office building. The most powerful lobbyists were ignored. They were treated like the rest of us. When I used to lobby, I used to have to lurk outside the men and women's room to get a meeting. Jay Melsinski and some of the most powerful lobbyists in Connecticut did not have the access and influence that they once had, in part because we also passed, when we passed the public financing law, we passed a ban on state contractor contributions. We passed a ban on lobbyist contributions. That was later struck down, but we've instead done low lobbyist contributions. We also closed a lot of loopholes. We had some political action committees that could give unlimited amounts to candidates. Corporate PACs could give far more than labor PACs, and we equalized those. So we shut down a lot of other loopholes, and it meant that candidates elected could walk in a building and not worry about who gave them money. They could take up bills and take up legislation that had nothing to do with who gave them money. They could also vote based on their conscience. So it has been remarkable, and we'll talk about some of the reforms we saw in Connecticut too. I just want to run through a little bit more of the logistics of what a program looks like. So a candidate for governor would raise $250,000 in small contributions of $5 to $100. This is not easy if you're running for statewide office, and believe me, candidates complained. Not that they didn't qualify for the public financing program, but they were looking at collecting 4,000, 4,500 contributions from real people. They couldn't just go to the lobbyist friends and corporate CEOs that usually gave money. When they raised the qualifying amount of money, they would get a grant for the primary of $1.25 million for governor, and then in the general election, $6 million. For state senate, raising $15,000, you get a grant in the primary for $35,000, and then a general election grant of $85,000. If you look at what kind of candidates, how many people have participated in this program, in 2010, 100% of statewide winners ran under the program. 74% of all General Assembly candidates participated, and overall in the 2 years, it's been between 70 and 74% participation rate. So that means that people elected come into office not having to worry about where they're raising their money from. We also saw that there is a huge rise in the number of small contributions as a result of this reform. Historically, statewide candidates relied mostly on special interest money and large contributors for their campaigns. And as you can see, in 2002, 5% of statewide candidates' money came from small contributions of $100 or less. In 2006, that was 8%. And in 2010, that jumped to 97% small contributions. Public Campaign, one of our allies that has a booth out in the hall, has also done some studies in Arizona and Maine to look at the demographic profile of who's giving. And it's very interesting because you find more middle-class people giving, more people at the lower end of the demographic profile, and in zip codes where there are poorer communities, instead of just a few of the wealthiest communities giving to candidates. And we believe that's very important. I'm going to skip through. I wanted to make one other point. As the Citizens United decision came down, and there was another court decision called the Arizona Free Enterprise decision and another bad Supreme Court decision that struck down matching funds that we provide to publicly financed candidates if they face an independent expenditure campaign or if they face a wealthy candidate. We're no longer allowed to provide those. And so Connecticut's going to work on doing a fix to allow candidates to raise more small contributions to counter that. But I think there's one important lesson in Connecticut that it's important to know. You don't need to raise or have as much money as a wealthy candidate you're running against. You don't need a dollar-for-dollar match, nor do you have to have a dollar-for-dollar match for independent expenditures that are targeted against you. And I want to use the example of Dan Malloy, who's a Democrat who ran for governor in 2010 and won. In the Democratic primary, he ran against a millionaire, Ned Lamont. Many of you know him, and we like Ned Lamont. He's a great guy. He spent $9.75 million against the $2.75 million that Dan Malloy had. And let me just skip to this chart here, because I'd like to show, this is in a 2-month period from late June to early August. Dan Malloy was polling at 22%. And Lamont was polling at 46%. And then if you look in early August, Malloy, in a 2-month time span since he got his publicly financed grants, he went up to 58%, and Ned Lamont actually lost some ground during that time. So then people were very excited. Dan Malloy had won. Well, then he faced a millionaire in the Republican general election. So he spent $6 million, and Foley spent $9.25 million. But once again, Dan Malloy prevailed. Why? Because he had enough resources to get his message out, and he wasn't drowned out. It didn't have to be a dollar-for-dollar match. What's important is that you have the resources to get your message out. We also had a Republican gubernatorial candidate who ran under the publicly financed system. And Michael Fedeli actually ran against Tom Foley, who eventually prevailed in the primary. Michael Fedeli came from behind and essentially in 1 month went from 13%, he polled at 13%, up to 39%, just 3 percentage points short of Tom Foley once he got the resources he needed to get his message out. So I think it's important to point out that even though there are independent expenditures out there, even though we need to do a fix to our campaign finance law, if you have enough resources, you can still run a competitive campaign and you can still win. The last point I want to make about public financing, I think is one of the most important ones. At a time when we've seen many states, and I have chapters in many of these states, where we have seen states and Republican governors taking over or legislatures flipping to Republican control, and we've seen terrible budget fights, union busting, anti-collective bargaining rights legislation, terrible vote suppression laws going through, and other things that are just slashing budgets for the poor, the sick, the elderly. Connecticut was the first state to pass paid sick leave, and we did it just this past year. And we also passed the largest tax increase in state history. Having this kind of reform, there are opportunities to break the link that where special interests are lobbying against reforms and pass progressive reforms. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the reforms that we passed in the past couple years. We've passed a very important environmental legislation. In fact, when environmentalists tried to expand the bottle bill and reclaim $20 million of unclaimed bottle sheets. Those are deposits that the bottlers get to keep. Tried to claim them for the state budget. The bottling industry and its lobby gave so much money to the House and Senate, they defeated it every year. The first year the publicly financed legislature took office, and this was in January of 2009, the first thing they did was expanded the bottle bill to include water bottles and other for recycling, and they reclaimed that $20 million that more than paid for the public financing system, $20 million each year that comes now into the general fund. So you can get all kinds of very progressive reforms passed if you break that grip between special interests, giving, and legislative campaigns. We still have work to do. I also don't want to simplify this. The truth is that this legislation was appealed. We were sued. We had 6 years of litigation. This went from the district court to the appeals court, all the way to the Supreme Court, but it's been upheld as constitutional. We've done fixes along the way, and we believe it can be a model for many other states to do this kind of reform. So thank you.